healthcare is on the ballot. Okay. And I think that Louisianans want someone who is a fighter, which I am, and who's going to fight for their health care.
We are Louisiana Indivisible. From New Orleans to North Louisiana, from Baton Rouge to the Bayou, from Shreveport to St. Bernard Parish, from Lake Charles to Lafayette to Leesville. Together, we can defend our democracy. We Are Louisiana Indivisible is highlighting people, politicians, and organizations across the state and region that understand there are no kings but king cakes in Louisiana, and that y'all will always mean all. Listen, share with your friends and neighbors, and help us work for a better tomorrow in Louisiana and beyond. Welcome to We Are Louisiana Indivisible. I am your host, Joel Sharpton, and I am super excited to have another one of our fantastic candidates for Senate in 2026 in Louisiana, Nick Albares. Nick, welcome to the show.
Joel, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It was so good to meet you the other night. You came to Lincoln Parish and Ruston for a DPEC executive committee meeting. We had a little candidates forum there. It was a lot of fun. I got to meet you in person. I got to meet Matt Gromlich in person. Conrad, I had already met previously. He and I bumped into each other way back in the spring last year at a empty chair town hall for some of these representatives that are not doing much representing, Nick. And I am so thankful to have seen people like him and you and Matt and Jamie Davis all step up, say, okay, I'll put my name out there. I'll throw my hat in the ring. Talk to us a little bit before we get into the deep stuff about that decision. What made you decide? I mean, look, we've talked about it off air. These are long odds races. You're fighting a great deal of money in this race if you can make it through the primary. And so what made you say, yeah, now's the time for me to put my name out there?
Well, Joel, again, thank you so much for having me. To tell you a little bit about my thinking, first of all, when I look at this moment, and I'm going to try, the kids are in the background if you hear any noise back there, but you know what? I've got 3 boys, ages 11, 9, and 6. And when I think about this moment, when I think about the fact that they cannot look up to their leaders in Washington, they cannot see people acting with decency, with respect. They cannot see people who are working clearly for every person. I said I need to step up in order to be a model of what change can look like. And so for me, it was very much a moral decision, because what I see in this country is billionaires that are making out like bandits, that are doing just fine, but that seems to be where it stops. We're seeing healthcare cuts that everyone on the Republican side has affirmed. Those go into effect January 1st, 2027. Throughout my career, I've fought for healthcare access. I've fought against healthcare cuts. And so I said, I need to get into the U.S. Senate so I can reverse what they voted for. And so, Joel, let me just say this. You mentioned a long shot. I have to be really clear about this. I got into this race with a theory of victory. And I'm not out here just putting my name out or waiting for the next thing or looking at the future of what's to come. And all of that can be well and good down the line. But right now, I'm focused on winning this U.S. Senate seat in November. There's a lot that we need to do from now until then, but I'm prepared and I'm ready to do it. And I have a plan, and we're going to execute the plan step by step.
Ooh, I like the sound of that, Nick. I like the sound of that. And I do think it's possible. I was having a conversation earlier today with a friend of mine from Texas. He said, how are the politics right now in Louisiana? I said, it strangely feels hopeful. It feels like a hopeful moment. Even our current sitting senator, which theoretically you would face in the general election, he's got a heck of a primary fight, a 3-way fight over who loves Trump the most over there. And it's such a strange moment to watch them play that out and spend all of that money. I joked with one of my old radio buddies. I'm sure the radio stations and the TV stations are making it hand over fist right now. So good for them, I guess. But it does seem like there's a moment where even very conservative members of this Louisiana population are fed up with what their party is giving them and see that they are not representing and not helping the average people. We see these giant construction projects happening in District 4 with the Meta data center, or excuse me, District 5 and the Meta data center, District 4 with the Amazon data centers that are coming. Again, it's another moment, Nick, where they are taking all of Louisiana's amazing resources and funneling that profit somewhere else, man. So I do think people are beginning to wake up, and I think you're right. I think we don't need to just talk about possibilities or future openings, talk about the moment. So let's talk about your moment for a little while and what led you here. Not born and raised in Louisiana, but native born in New Orleans, right? Tell us a little bit about you grew up in Dothan, Alabama. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I was born here in New Orleans. I'm a native of New Orleans. Both my parents were born and raised here. But when I was young, my family was in healthcare. And my dad, who had done all of his training at Charity Hospital in New Orleans, the family moved down I-10 a bit to Dothan, Alabama. I grew up there, and I went to study in college theology at the University of Notre Dame. And it was during that time that the levees broke here in New Orleans, and New Orleans was devastated. And as we all saw, the impacts of poor planning and poor policy from our leaders. I got involved in the rebuilding process, gutting and rebuilding homes during my spring and fall breaks and summer break. But I said, it's more than homes that needed to be gutted and rebuilt. It was policies. And so, from a moral perspective, from a theological perspective, thinking about, in this case, Christian teachings, but really teachings that span the course of religion. Who is my neighbor? Thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the fact that the Samaritan and was someone who was not aligned with the person that was beaten on the roadside, and the fact that we need to come together in order to get good policy done, that really animated my steps along the journey. So I went up to DC after 5 years working for Catholic Charities in New Orleans, and got my master's in public policy. So I wanted to marry this kind of ethical foundation with the nuts and bolts of how to really get policy done. And I came back to Louisiana when Governor John Bel Edwards was elected, first working for the Louisiana Budget Project on policy analysis, and then working in Governor Edwards' administration as an advisor. For the past 6 years, I've worked for Volunteers of America, Southeast Louisiana, working to build innovative programs that meet community needs, serving people like veterans, people with disabilities, kids in need of mentoring, people that are struggling in a number of different ways. And so that's been extremely gratifying. And those are the values that I want to bring with me into the United States Senate.
Nick, I got to tell you, I didn't know until I started reading your bio the other day that I owed you maybe a cup of coffee or something someday. But genuinely, you and Governor Edwards' administration, the expansion of Medicaid and the adoption and the full-throated approval and working with the ACA once it was made law as well, have done a tremendous amount of good for my family personally. I'm a small business owner. I'm a solo entrepreneur, and have been since 2016. But even before that, I worked in small market radio and in nonprofits. And none of the businesses that I've ever worked for have ever offered me any sort of a healthcare plan. And in America, that means you're screwed, very frankly, as a rule, or it used to anyway. And it currently does again because of how they have gutted provision after provision of the ACA as they have tried to whittle it away down over the last 10 years. But genuinely, it was a moment where my family was struggling. My wife had come home out of the school system to be a stay-at-home mom with our young girls. She was losing money every month on childcare to work as a para in the local school system. Came home and kept our girls for a couple of years. We got them back in school, and now it's been useful to have her here to be able to run back and forth and take care of all the school meetings while dad does the stuff that I do online and traveling throughout the year as well. At first, we were hurting so bad that the Medicaid expansion was very helpful to my family. It provided us health care for a few years. And then the ACA subsidies have meant that for the last several years, myself, my wife both had great health care, honestly. And yes, it wasn't perfect. Yes, our premiums were still there. Our copays were still there, et cetera, et cetera. But what has happened now, as those subsidies have been gutted, it is now out of reach for my wife and I, at least, and we are currently just cash pay only for our health care. That is an untenable situation for most people. We're fortunate that we've got enough in the bank to keep our needs met and keep moving forward. But I know that that is beyond an impediment, beyond a headache, beyond a hassle for a lot of Louisiana families. It is an impossibility. What are we going to do when you take office in November? What is the first thing that we can do to attack that healthcare problem specifically at the federal level? You've done a lot of good at the state level when you were in Governor Edwards' administration. What can we do once you're in that Senate seat?
Well, you mentioned those subsidies. I mean, number one, we've got to restore those. Number two, we've got to restore and reverse the Medicaid cuts that are set to go into effect January 1st, 2027. So there's an article that came out recently looking at the impacts that are going to occur once these Medicaid changes go into effect. And now look, Republicans in Congress, they've made the effective date January 1st, 2027 for a reason. The reason is because they wanted it after the midterm elections. So it's incumbent upon me to let everyone know, all your listeners, everyone watching at home, healthcare is on the ballot. Okay. And I think that Louisianans want someone who is a fighter, which I am, and who's going to fight for their health care. And this has been something I've been working on my entire career. So I started working with Catholic Charities in 2008, and we were working on the Affordable Care Act. In fact, Joseph Gow, who was the congressman from New Orleans at the time, was the only Republican vote for the Affordable Care Act in its first form. He ended up not voting for the final bill, but we were working to get Joseph Gow's vote on the Affordable Care Act. We kept working, and that really has followed me my entire career. When I was at the Louisiana Budget Project, it was during the first Trump administration. I had gotten training in health policy through graduate school, and we took a town hall series around the state pushing back on the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. We all remember the dramatic thumbs down that John McCain gave on the Senate floor, which saved the Affordable Care Act at that time. But we made sure that Louisianans knew what our senators were pushing. And then going into the governor's administration, you mentioned the Medicaid expansion, which we were able to protect, defend. And one of the things as a health advisor, looking at ways that we could expand upon it. And there were attempts in the legislature to roll it back. We were able to produce legislation to keep it intact. And then with the reelection campaign, Eddie Rispone said he wanted to freeze Medicaid, and that would have led to a dramatic cut. So we were able to make the case, do another series of town halls around the state. And that's what I love doing, educating people and organizing people around our shared values. Because I think, like you said, Joel, everybody wants to have affordable health care available, right? This isn't something that only people who vote a certain way or are on one side of the aisle care about. People want protection for people with pre-existing conditions,
100%. It makes dollars and cents. I always try to say, if you look at the outcomes that we have nationwide, but especially statewide, compared to the amount of money that is spent through our healthcare system, through premiums and et cetera, you compare that to every other industrialized nation in the world. It is we are spending more and getting less. And those axes are moving in the wrong direction for us, not in the right direction. I am excited for that, but the urgency of it, absolutely, you're right, needs to be pushed, and people need to understand it. It's one of the things, it's the drumbeat that I'm going to start banging after we get through these amendments in May, in particular, that Governor Landry is pushing. Nick, let's move to a little bit more broader federal policy. We've spoken to several House candidates, we've spoken to a couple of local state candidates, and there are a lot of issues there. But in particular, the Senate has such a voice to say on things like accountability for the purse, accountability for the war powers, accountability for judges, and disrespect and ignorance of commands from those judges. And we're seeing a lot of that. Trump is the easy one to point to, and there's plenty that we could point directly. But this is not just a Trump problem. There is a systemic abuse of the judiciary, especially across agencies at the federal level. And there seems to be currently a lack of interest from the Senate and from the House, especially, to do anything about it. So, do you see any potential? I do think that we've got a good opportunity to not just win your seat, but to win a majority in the Senate, but it will still be slim. How do we begin to reach some of those more moderate colleagues that you might find then on the right and say, let us find some common ground and put back in the rule of law? Let's establish some boundaries again.
Right. The rule of law, putting in place the Constitution as it lays out with the separation of powers. This should be something that the legislative branch is focused on, because the legislative branch should not just be another tool of the executive. The framers had a very specific reason for creating separation of powers. And when you look at the campaigns that are being run on the other side, you mentioned it, Joel, they are running on one message specifically. It's who is closest to the president, right? That seems to be all that they care about, and then trying to portray their rival as being furthest from the president. And I think that Louisianans want somebody who's going to stand on their own 2 feet and who's going to be a fighter for the people, right? Because I think that we as Louisianans, we want solutions. We don't want just talking points from people who are just interested in getting into office and maintaining power. So to the question about building bridges with more moderate Republicans, that's something that I've found an ability to do throughout my career. And I'll give you an example. And this goes back to healthcare. So, I fought for healthcare access all through the years. And when there was a challenge to Medicaid by this current Congress, we developed a care coalition, bring together healthcare professionals and providers and nonprofits that were ready to stand up for our Medicaid system and for those who receive coverage through Medicaid, whether it's Medicaid expansion or whether it's people with disabilities or children that all receive care through Medicaid. We came together and we developed a resolution that we brought before members of the Louisiana state legislature. Now, this was a non-binding resolution, but it basically called on Congress to not put in place massive Medicaid cuts. We brought that resolution forward and we were able to get it approved unanimously in the Louisiana State Senate and overwhelmingly in the House. And of course, we know there are Republican supermajorities there. So we were able to work with the membership and make the case for how this was going to impact their constituents. And so they pushed back on Congress through that. And that resolution was actually mentioned by Leader Jeffries on the House floor in his speech condemning H.R. 1, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill Act, the bill that we know that cut Medicaid substantially in order to fund tax cuts for billionaires. And so I think it is tapping into those shared values, but for me, it's also the way that I'm able to connect with folks. And I'm always about results and getting things done. And so I'm going to state very clearly what my values are, but I'm going to be ready to get to work, to roll up my sleeves and do what needs to be done in order to advance shared interests. And so I'm fully prepared and ready to work with people of goodwill who are also ready to put in place solutions. And I think part of that at the legislative level is taking back our power and not being an arm of the executive branch.
Nick, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. You worked very closely with him for a long time, and I am genuinely a big admirer. I think he is a good example of how you can run and espouse progressive policies in a quote unquote red state and still be very popular. What did you learn? What's the biggest thing that you learned from Governor Edwards?
So, one of the things that I learned from Governor Edwards was to focus on the people, and I'm coming back to healthcare because this is where a lot of my work focused. Governor Edwards always said that Medicaid expansion was the easiest big decision that he made. It was an easy decision because it provided health coverage to 500,000 people. Most of it was financed through the federal government. It didn't cost the Louisiana taxpayer anything at all. Now Congress is trying to take away some of the funding mechanisms in order to provide that Medicaid coverage. But, doing the right thing when it's presented shouldn't be complicated. And look, a big thing for me, we talk about, coming from a faith-based perspective. Governor Edwards always said that Matthew 25, whatsoever you do to the least of these, was his favorite scripture. And that's something that we connected on because it's about no matter your religious background, how do we take care of our neighbors? How do we create policy that's creating healthier communities? How do we make the decisions that are in the best interests of everyone, no matter how you voted? And that was something, Governor Edwards was always big on, not doesn't matter if someone voted for him or not, he was going to be looking out for their interests. And so I think being practical, being solutions oriented, and then putting in the work. He was a hard worker. We dealt with some hard times with budget crises. And, so I can remember being down on the House floor and working with some of the members on the Republican side in order to get a working family tax credit passed. That's the earned income tax credit that puts more money in the hands of working people. That was something where the votes were not coming easily. We had to grind it out. And in fact, that was a special session that was going to midnight. And so we were working the House chambers, through 11 o'clock. And I can just remember Governor Edwards was, he played quarterback in high school, and he was the quarterback, and we were on the field, and he was encouraging us, and we were down there in constant communication. And I think, look, that's one of the things that I bring to this fight. I was talking to somebody the other day. This will be my first elected office, but I would say I'm a redshirt freshman. I've been behind the scenes in public service, and I'm going to be ready to take the field on day one because I know how to work a committee room. I know how public policy works. I know how to work across the aisle, which is going to be necessary. But I also know how to stand in my truth, stand in my power, stand in my values, and not let go of them. And so, it's something that I think in the United States Senate, we need someone who's going to be ready because the issues aren't getting easier. The climate in Washington is not going to get better overnight, but it will start to shift when the voters step out and say, we're ready for an end to the chaos. We're ready to bring decency, goodness, and respect back to these offices that should be based in those values.
let's talk a little bit about those voters stepping out. This is something that I'm personally concerned about and focused on over these next couple of months, I guess, as we approach this May um, primary election specifically, and the amendments that are on the ballot in Louisiana. Voter registration, voter turnout have always been a problem in Louisiana. We have a low turnout in a country that has a low turnout. You know, um, I remember specifically, it tickled me so much. I'm sure you remember the moment too. Speaker Mike Johnson was caught on a hot mic talking about they expected 27% or something like that turnout for that amendment vote last year, and they were
Yeah.
shocked by it. He and Governor Landry were both shocked by it. Knew that it was going to be a problem for them if they turned out. Um, what can we do about that, especially once we get you in that Senate office? What can we do to, first of all, educate the populace? Because I do think so they'll quote these statistics, 90% of Americans are for voter ID at the ballot box, et cetera, et cetera. Voter ID at the ballot box is a different thing than the SAVE Act or removing every DMV and parish after parish or county after county or all of the other measures that we've seen take place. What can we do to, first of all, change that message? And second of all, codify and lock in some restraints and guardrails to make it more difficult for a gregarious administration like Landry's to come in and try to hurt the average Louisianian voter. I mean, I'm a good example, Nick. I am a very active voter. I'm very loud about my politics and my activity in politics. And yet I was on the inactive voter list. Why?
Mm.
The argument was that a 1099 went to a former address of mine or something, and so they flagged me into. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't nefarious. Maybe it happened for decent reasons. What do we do to help stop that and to help stop that bleeding and help make people understand that their voice and their vote do matter, and get out there on election day?
Yeah. Joel, the right to vote ought to be completely sacrosanct in this country. It should be one of the most fundamental rights that we have in a democracy. And it must be protected, it must be defended. And we have to remember here in the United States that the Voting Rights Act, in particular, was put in place for a reason, and it should be safe and easy to vote for every American, period. And so I think that, a few things. We need to get out the vote, do voter registration drives, especially with these new closed primaries. We need to continue to educate people about what's going on. I do hear from folks, oh, it feels like we're always voting here in Louisiana. And so looking at how we can consolidate elections. I know that's not always possible because we have things, we have special elections that come up. But I think that talking about how voter fraud is a complete Republican boogeyman that's designed to suppress the vote, that needs to be brought to the surface. And as you said, when I have that platform, I'm going to be shouting that from the rooftops, using my communication channels to say, look, the real issue is we need to get our voter turnout up, because that's what happens in a healthy democracy when people are coming out to vote. And we can continue to educate people about what's on the ballot at the local level, because so often, those local elections are super, super important. And at the federal level, we need to remind people about what is on the ballot. Like I'm saying over and over, healthcare is on the ballot. Nearly 2 million people in the state of Louisiana receive health coverage through Medicaid. And that's going to be cut significantly. People need to know that. And so we can always look at ways to expand early voting. We can expand the ways that people can vote just to make sure that it is accessible. Because again, we should year after year be looking at the voter turnout trends. And when they're not going in the right direction, we need to find ways, look at what other states are doing in order to maximize that, because that's going to tell us how healthy our democracy is.
100%. It is the absolute bugaboo for me. It bothers me. I look at that number every time and I get angry all over again, Nick, after every election. Um, okay, I want to say thank you so much for your time. First of all, I know this election cycle has already been a heavy load on you and your family. Having a young family in Louisiana is hard enough on its own. I know I got 4 kids myself. Um, Talk to me a little bit about that though. You were born here. You came back here to make a life and raise your family with your wife. Your wife's from Louisiana. She even went to Louisiana Tech, didn't she? Didn't I hear that right in your?
Yeah, that's right. So my wife is originally from the greater New Orleans area. She grew up in Metairie, but she went up to Tech to get her undergraduate in art education, and then she stayed for her master's in curriculum and instruction. So she loved her time up in Ruston, and I've loved visiting the times that I've made it up there. So
It's
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
nice town, man. I've spent a little more than or most of the last 2 decades here, I guess, close to 3 now, and it is a good place to call home. I love Louisiana. I was born here. I was raised here. Other than a couple of summers in Ohio, I've spent my whole life here, and I love this state. There's so much to love about it. The people, the music, the food, the culture. It is genuinely a jewel in what is a great country. And yet, I look at those 4 kiddos. One's headed to LSU in the fall, and I'm like, baby, maybe after graduation, maybe try somewhere else. I've got a boy that'll graduate next year. I've got 2 girls that are 12 this year, and I don't know that I will push hard for them to grow their young families in Louisiana. And I think of all the things that I would want to see changed in this state between here and that place where I would gladly say, "Oh yeah, y'all need to raise them babies here." How do you feel about that? What can we do? Do you see in the 15, 20 years that you and I need to be working on this before they're trying to raise families, do you see us being able to close that gap?
Yeah, I do. I think if we bring the right leaders into the positions in order to enact the change that's necessary, then yes. I think that, my wife and I, we're here in Louisiana. We she's only been away for 3 years when we moved up to DC. We moved up to DC. I went to graduate school, and, I've been here in Louisiana since I graduated from college, other than those 3 years in DC. We live in Gentilly here in New Orleans. We spent 4 years in Baton Rouge as well. And I agree with you, Joel. I mean, this is a beautiful state. One of like my favorite things about running a statewide race is just being able to visit so many different places, because there's such diversity throughout the state. When you talk about what North Louisiana has and Acadiana and everywhere else. And so, look, we got to remember that we need to fight for a Louisiana where our kids can call home. We need to fight for the infrastructure, for the health care, for all of the systems, the education. Because look, we can have those things. It is a policy choice. When we talk about the billionaires that are doing just fine, we need to make sure that they are paying their fair share. I want us to take just a minute to think about what $1 billion really is. And so, I like to think about this number. We think about a millionaire. A million is a lot to begin with. That would be quite a lot of money. But 1 million seconds is 11 days. Okay, so let's think about that. A million seconds is 11 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 years. So 11 days versus
Jeez.
31 years. That's how much we're talking about in terms of $1 billion. There is so much that we can do if we ask billionaires to pay their fair share. So the reality is that Washington has failed Louisianans, and I'm running to be the voice for Louisianans, to put people over politics and to be someone that is standing next to them. I said when I qualified my political philosophy is simple. Every person is important. Every person has dignity, and our policy ought to reflect that. And that means that people are able to thrive and flourish in their communities. That means that when someone has a good idea that they want to turn into a business, that they have the resources in order to do that. And they have the healthcare system, the educational system to facilitate that. And so that's what I'm going to be committed to throughout this race. That's what I'm going to be committed to when I enter the United States Senate is putting in place the policies that we know. Because here's the thing, when you study policy, when I studied at Georgetown, you learn what works, right? What actually moves the needle to build communities that flourish. And so I start from this moral lens of like everybody matters, everybody's important. And then policy is the way that we are able to get closer to that vision of the beloved community, that vision of everyone thriving and meeting their full potential.
Man, I think that's a lovely way for us to wrap up. Nick, before we do, first of all, let's talk about dates real quick because we got a lot of important ones coming up. So you mentioned the new closed primary system. Let's talk through that for a second. So obviously, if you're registered as a Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary. If you're registered as a Republican, you can vote in the Republican primary. However, the state of Louisiana recognizes no other parties. So if you are independent or if you're a Green Party or anything like that, you need to register as no party, and then you can choose which primary you want to vote in. If you vote in the Democratic primary, you'll have to vote in the Democratic runoff, right? Not, and vice versa. If you vote in the Republican primary, you have to vote in but regardless of what primary you vote for, or vote in, you can vote for whichever general election candidate that you find the right one. We know which one we think you might find the right one already, but our
Number one on your
dates though,
ballot.
you got to have that. You got to have that party primary. You got to have the party registration done by when? April 15th, right? Do I have that right?
April 15th in person. You have until April 25th to make the change online if you do it online on the Secretary of State website.
Nice. And then the primary itself is in May.
That's right. So early voting is May 2nd through 9th, excluding May 3rd, which is the Sunday. And then election day is May 16th. Yeah, if there's a runoff, then June 27th is the date of the runoff. And then I fully expect to be running in the election on November 3rd is the general election day. But yeah, we'll focus on those May dates because those are coming up fast. Those are the first opportunities you'll have to vote for me. I'm going to be number one on your ballot. NickForLouisiana.com is the website if you want to check it out. So
Perfect. And they can find your socials and all your links and make a donation if they'd like to there as well. Folks, we need you to get ready for those primaries in May. May 16th is the actual election date, but there are opportunities to vote early. I think, honestly, the Landry administration and the legislature did us a favor. They've got those amendments on the same day as the primary election. I think we're going to get good turnout for both, Nick. I think we're going to vote all of those amendments down, or most of them down anyway. I won't tell you how to vote, but I do want you to go and read up on those. There's some
that's
squirrely
right.
language, just like they did last year. We want you to make sure you understand what you're voting for, and then get out there and vote. Make sure your neighbors vote. Make sure your mama votes. Nick Albares, running for Senate in Louisiana. I am so thankful to have you on the show, and so thankful for you working hard for the people of Louisiana.
Joel, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everybody who's out there listening in. I really appreciate this opportunity. I really appreciate connecting with everyone. I hope to meet you in person sometime soon because I love connecting with people and listening to people. And I'm going to fight for you and build bridges in order to create a healthier, stronger, more flourishing Louisiana. So thank you all.